Hello and welcome to this video on Swell from Bartola Instruments, a harmonic filter with valve tone shaping that can both remove and add harmonics to your sounds. Here's what's to come in the video. This video is sponsored by Bartola Instruments. So this is Swell, a 14 HP low-pass filter that Bartola Instruments are calling a harmonic filter. It sits at a crossroads between East and West Coast synthesis ideas, as it can saturate, distort and even gently fold your waveforms just as easily as it can carve out harmonics with its filtering. At the heart of its design is a Cold War era military valve, and valves are something that Bartola has been designing and working with for many years, both in the hi-fi world making valves act as cleanly as possible, and then across many Eurorack designs that then exploit valves for their non-linearities and their character. If you'd like to know more about Ale from Bartola Instruments, there's an interview on DivKidvideo.com, and I'll link that down in the description below. So getting into the features here, Swell is a 24 dB per octave 4-pole low-pass filter, and it has a valve stage that you can place pre or post with this switch, so you can have the filter first or last in the signal chain. For filtering, you get the standard controls, for frequency and resonance, and for frequency, then the cutoff there, you have an FM input with an FM attenuverter for that CV or external signal, and you have a volt per octave pitch tracking input too. It's worth noting that the output of the module actually normals back to the FM input, so you can play with feedback modulation where the audio coming out of it modulates the frequency of the filter, and that opens a really wide range of additional sounds. You can also modulate the resonance, which is unattenuated, and you also have a switch here called comp, which is the Q compensation, and when that's on, that keeps the low end at higher resonance settings, and when that's off, that reacts like a classic kind of Moog ladder filter where higher resonance kind of takes away from the low end. And the rest of the controls then are all for the gain staging and valve control throughout the module. For gain and level, we have the gain knob, which is a master level, the drive knob, which is a pre-valve gain and pushes it into saturation, and you have a switch for the gain which can be high or low level post-valve, and there's also a boost switch to double the gain too, and all of these controls are nicely interactive. And then specifically for determining the valve behaviour, there's a mode switch to select T triode, which is a warmer sound, or P for pentode, which is typically more aggressive. There's then a bias switch for hot or cold biasing, where when it's cold it's more warm and compressed, and when set to hot that's clearer in the triode mode and more wild in the pentode mode. And then as we mentioned for the filtering, you can choose the position that the valve is set to pre or post, so before or after the filter. The quick start guide is well worth a look for some ideas about how all these switches interact and create different behaviours, and there's lots more documentation for those that are interested on the Bartola website too. And it's worth noting that as the filter self-oscillates and tracks volt per octave, it works well as an oscillator, with the advantage of a lot of smart valve shaping here, so while you can get clean sines, like most other oscillating filters, it goes way beyond that if you place the filter before that valve stage and then further shape the signal. As you can maybe imagine, I lean pretty heavily into the saturation and unique side of what Swell does for the video, though we do clean things up and show a range of sounds. The patches are on screen now and linked down in the description, so skip around as you like, and without further ado, let's dive in. So let's check out the sound of Swell here. We'll start with the valve processing pre, so we're shaping the input, which is this blue trace saw wave here, rather than the sound of the filter afterwards. This will be a little bit quieter, but we'll then kick that into post and really explore that range of kind of warm, compressed saturation and really pushing it into some folding and some mad feedback FM behaviours. That's a relatively quick look at the range of sounds, just to give you an idea how it sounds sweeping that filter and playing with the shaping over a basic saw wave oscillator. Let's get into the patches. So here we've got some absolutely mad acidic filtering sounds. It's so full on, as I say, you kind of call it mad acid. Now outside of the synth sound, these are my drums, and I'll kind of cancel out, clean up the settings on Swell, adjust my modulation, and we'll kind of go from the beginning and build up the sound again. So my sound starts with a saw wave from this basic Fonk analog oscillator. The saw wave is the input to Swell. Swell outputs into Manic here being used as a VCA, just offsetting that fully open with no modulation of level for now. So super characterful already. If I just start modulating from here, because of the normaling of the output to the FM, let's actually get some resonance on there, really emphasize it. So that's turning the resonance up, and the FM, which when not patched is a normal from the output, so it's feedback through to the frequency modulation. Because I want that there, I'm actually using the volt per octave as my frequency modulation input. And I'm using this dual VCA as a mixer with two modulation sources. One is this blue trace decay envelope, the second is this yellow trace sequence from step 8. So if I turn up the first channel here, we'll send some envelope to the frequency of the filter. And just that with some resonance. It's already a great kind of acid sound if that's what you're looking for. Adding that bit more resonance, bit of FM. It's almost like a screaming kind of Sherman filter bank thing. So envelope modulation on this channel, coming into the volt per octave, and the second one is this step 8 sequence. And I can then mix these together, but let's play around here. If I add some more gain, push up the gain slightly in the drive, more res. Sounds like an acidic filter through a distortion pedal. So let's add some envelope modulation and some of that sequence. And then on my VCA, I'm using the top trace, the green trace here, as my envelope, which would do this in a normal VCA. But I'm inverting the CV, so that becomes a kind of ducking sidechain. Hope you can hear that pump. It's going to make this pump around my kick drum. And let's just play around for a moment. I'll bring the drums back in. So here I'm using Swell in an effects feedback loop. It's just giving this gorgeous kind of like blissed out tapey analog thing. If I push the gain up full here and just mute my dry sound, it's like a kind of blown out tape echo that really kind of offsets with its degradation and kind of crunchiness the nice melody that we have going on. So muting my wet effects here in my output mixer, this is my dry sound. Now the output, all the white cables, is the dry sound here and the clocking for my effects. I have the dry output here in my output mixer. But I'm also splitting on this stacking cable a copy of this dry sound into a little 2-channel VCA mixer here, and that mixer is what feeds the input stage of my effects. My effects then output in stereo fully wet in the mix. Let's listen to those. But again, a split here is taken. You can use stacking cables or a multiple, any kind of splitter. A split of the output, and this is fully wet here on Cosmic Debris, comes into Swell. The sound comes through Swell and comes back out into the input mixer that feeds those effects. And that's what creates the feedback loop. So in this mixer, the dry sound is turned up. If I turn that down, it stops feeding sound to Cosmic Debris here, my effects. But the other side is Swell. So if I turn up that level in this input mixer, input to the effects that is, and turn up the gain on Swell, and I'll just crank it full to start with. We can hear this lovely analog feedback path emerging. I could even remove the dry sound now. And this is just Cosmic Debris through Swell, back into Cosmic Debris through Swell. And with the drive and gain up, and just a cut off that I felt sounded good, it's this lovely blooming gritty feedback loop. But we can really amplify this with noise, and here it is in the green trace on data here in the green cables. If I turn up the noise that I have patched into FM to frequency modulate the filter, again I'll just go full. Really adds to that kind of like degraded lo-fi gritty tape thing. You can push the gain up even more. And while all that's happening, let's just mute the effects and go back to the dry plat sound. I can patch that noise, as I have, into the FM of the oscillator. So that gives my dry input sound this kind of warble and instability. So let's kind of build all this up again. I'll turn the gain down, turn the noise down. I'll leave the dry sound in the mix this time. Unmute the effects. Bring up the feedback through Swell. And I'm just adjusting the gain. God, it's gorgeous. And then I'll add the noise modulation of Swell. Maybe not full this time. So I noticed in the quick start guide for Swell that there's a certain setting on these switches that will introduce a wavefold-like behaviour. Now that's a behaviour that will vary from unit to unit. More extreme patches like this will kind of highlight the variances in those valves, but you'll get a wavefold nonetheless, quite subtle in this case. But I want it to really just kind of destroy a sine wave here. And I'm confident that I've succeeded. But it's ended on what I didn't expect, which is this kind of overblown wind, kind of croaking, blasted out reed-like sound. And if I just pull this back to something really simple here, this patch is a sine wave from this Fonk oscillator that's volt per octave modulated. That comes through a VCA that has an envelope opening and closing the sound. I've just offset this fully open for now, and that modulated VCA sine wave is the input to Swell. At the moment I have the volt per octave coming into Swell 2, although it's not really having any effect here. And you can see on this gain and drive we start to introduce this kind of folding back of that waveform. You can play with that with the gain and the drive. Let's get that VCA moving before Swell again, so turning this down and turning up my envelope. We've got this kind of soft fold, which just sounds really warm and musical. But I've emphasised this here by turning up the resonance into oscillation, so I'm just being careful here. So that input sort of slams into that resonance, and as the sound comes down, that resonance continues. But into the resonance CV, and through an attenuator here on this VCA, I have an LFO. So you can hear we get this lovely tremolo of the resonance by using an attenuated LFO to modulate it. And we can tune that frequency just to an interval that suits the resonance as a sine wave at the input. There's not really anything to filter. Well too. Let's come up higher a bit like I had it at the start. And if we add some FM, taking the output back into the FM, it really does get quite crazy. And that attenuator there for FM making a massive difference in how that feedback modulates the filter. So here's some cleaner filtering from Swell, and I wanted to do that to show its character as I've been really kind of hammering that valve and all the things it does so well. And although there has been some cleaner patches, I wanted one that just stayed clean throughout. I have some delay on and an arpeggiator playing. Let's remove the effects. And going through the patch here, this is like a basic monosynth setup. I have a saw wave oscillator, single saw wave as my input. I'm coming out into a VCA. I'm modulating the VCA with a basic envelope, this green trace here. I've got volt per octave tracking on the filter, so like many say basic subtractive monosynths, you can key track or pitch track, which is what I'm doing, the same volt per octave to the oscillator, to the volt per octave on Swell. But the FM is a mixture of these two sources. Again, something you could do on a lot of basic monosynths, which is modulating with an envelope and an LFO at the same time. Now if I open the VCA so it's just droning through, we've got these nice filter sweeps, adding a bit of resonance, and that combination by turning FM up of the envelope and the LFO. And we've got a nice cleaner filter sound. Now turning down the VCA so it's the envelope modulating it again. We could swap that LFO for say a step sequence. So if I patch across to this sequencer here, so it's now a mixture of a sequence and an envelope modulating the filter. But I'll stick to an LFO, add my effects back in, and just play for a moment before we move on. It's nice to enjoy this cleaner filtering, and just to remind myself, and you of course too, that Swell doesn't have to just be utterly filthy, as much as I enjoy the utter filth. So here we'll take a look at filter pings, kick drums, kind of warm, woolly, sub-bass meets percussion, which is where the patch currently is. But pulling things out here, my input is simply a trigger, and by turning up the resonance to just before oscillation, that's what a filter ping is here, just a trigger, exciting and almost oscillating, highly resonant filter. And that resonance will be the decay, and you can dial that into a range of percussive sounds. But my patch started then by, on the same rhythm as these triggers, having an envelope, which is this green trace here, and in an external mixer, I'm actually mixing two envelopes, but we'll just start with full range coming in here from this green trace envelope. That's coming in on the red cable here to the FM input. And by tuning that down low, we have a nice soft analog kick drum. We can push the gains and drive, but first we'll put this into post so this sound we're hearing from the filter is actually then going into this valve stage. Let's maybe clean up a little bit. Q compensation there makes a massive difference. If I start mixing my envelopes, and I'm doing this just off screen, I also have this quarter note envelope, the blue trace. What's interesting though is I'm pinging this with that original rhythm. So my FM modulation is just on quarter notes. But I'm pinging the filter with a different rhythm. It's really fun for a kind of hybrid kick drum and bass thing to start building a patch around. If I actually mix the two envelopes here, and the result of that will be on this red trace, and that's coming into the FM. Really nice percussive low end kick drum meets percussive bass type sound. I also have a volt proctive signal, which is just a simple sequence. I'll patch that straight in here to the volt proctive input. Let's just tune up a little bit more resonance. So with that last patch quickly kind of descending from filter pings into kick drums and kind of this hybrid, saturated, warm, woolly kind of kick drum bass thing, I thought I'd actually just make a separate patch for filter pings quite quickly here. So unplugging everything here, simply turning up that resonance again, just below oscillation. We have a filter ping with a trigger at the input, and it's the output that we're listening to. Now if I add a volt per octave, we have a nice simple filter ping voice. I have some FM that I can add from an oscillator tracking the same pitch here, and it's just a sine wave. I'm playing around with the tuning of Swell's frequency and my separate oscillator providing the FM. We can dial in some nice filter pings. If we turn the resonance down, we could use, say, a sequencer to sequence resonance level. And what I'll do is just set these roughly where I think a ping is happening, too much level into the resonance. And these will just oscillate like an oscillator. Too little and we'll just hear those kind of triggers coming in like clicks. So then we can decide to accent some steps with more resonance. And play with that decay, sometimes pushing into full sustaining oscillations, sometimes more clicky triggers with less resonant CV. And that's it, I just wanted a cleaner filter ping example as I descended into the depths of saturated kicks and bass in the other one. So here we're using Swell as an oscillator, and you're currently listening to it outputting it into two low-pass gates patched as a left and right stereo image, and I'm striking that low-pass gate differently on each side with volt per octave and some resonance modulation of Swell. Now let's go straight to the Swell actual direct output here, and we'll go pre for that valve, and I'll simply turn up the resonance, and we have a nice clean sine wave. But if we go post, we then have all the shaping of the valve, so it's much more than a clean sine oscillator, as many oscillating filters are here. If I change, say, to pentode mode, and I change to hot biasing, you can see we get this fold there in the waveform that I mentioned earlier in the video, or later in the video depending on how I edit it. You can just see this kind of kink just folding back in on itself. We can use the FM to route the output back to frequency modulation and get PWM and pitch-like changes. Let's go back to triode mode, cold biasing. I'll even put the Q compensation on. And we've got everything from a square, or very close to square, to more sine-like behaviours. And simply adding a volt per octave to this, we have Swell acting like a standard oscillator. And I thought I'd try and modulate resonance here, which I'm just backing off manually, from just under oscillation into oscillation with an envelope. But because resonance is a feedback in the circuit, it's not instant. So if I move to this sound, this exact sound we're listening to in a VCA with the same envelope that I'm going to patch into here, this is what it would sound like. Swell pitch tracking and oscillating into a VCA with an envelope. And you can hear that's just a kind of instant rise, decay, kind of percussive envelope. But if we go back to Swell in the mix, not through the VCA, and I use that same envelope to try and modulate the resonance, we'll get a really interesting kind of bouncy, kind of like slew or lag, that instant onset of the envelope, pushes it into oscillation but not instantly. So it adds a kind of natural feedback resonance driven kind of rise time or attack time. And I think that's quite an interesting sound, even if you then patch that back into the VCA. It adds a kind of tonal change that's not there when you're not modulating the resonance. So if again I take this direct swell output now into 2 channels of low pass gate, really interesting sound that goes way beyond just a standard sine oscillator. Here we're looking at Audiorate modulation, and at the moment it's dynamic Audiorate modulation, which is to say a modulated modulation depth coming into the FM here from my Audiorate oscillator. But removing that modulation, just making it static, here's one oscillator's sine wave FMing, frequency modulating the filter, when it has this saw wave in it. So again, the input is this saw wave, it's from Platts, but just a basic saw, and then it's a sine wave in blue here in this VCA coming through to the FM. Now it's currently tuned around the same rate. So there's a sort of unison effect, and if I just adjust the fine tune, that beating causes these kinks and shifts in the sound. But going an octave down, there's this really lovely kind of subharmonic tone coming through. You can really amplify with the resonance. Let's just play around with the tuning here, back off the resonance a little bit. And we can fine tune that sine into a nice interval. Maybe back off the depth of modulation a little bit, and then sweeping the filter manually. Let's tune a bit higher. A really nice response to this FM. If we tried to make this dynamic again, we could do so by turning down the VCA that this sine wave comes into, and then modulating the VCA level with an external signal, in this case a looping envelope. So that level of the sine wave now is being modulated before it comes into the FM. Play around with tuning again. Definitely try out some Audiorate modulation of FM there. And as with any modulation, patch it through a VCA first, and then be dynamic and kind of evolving in your modulation depths over time. So I've just made this patch and it's actually for the Erica Synths Resonant Filter Bank demo, but as it's such a good example of Swell just pushed really aggressively and dirty here, I thought I'd actually use it for the Swell demo. So if I mute everything except Swell, or let's just mute Swell first actually, I have some drums, kind of dubstep feeling thing. But if we listen to just the dry sound itself, this is an envelope modulating tides, and lots of random voltages moving, folding, wave skewing, shaping the harmonics in this digital oscillator. And what you're hearing now is what actually comes into Swell, and then I have a random voltage to the FM. Let's remove that for now. Go back to Swell. Nice, driven. Filtering, but pushing the res back up. Yeah, it's good fun. But then letting random voltages push that frequency around. It's so aggressive. All those shifting random harmonic changes hitting that randomly changing filter. That against the kick. Clap back in. Building the drums back up. It got even more aggressive than I was expecting there. If you've got this far in the video, drop a Swell sync down in the comments. Head to patreon.com/DivKid to get access to exclusives, videos and patch books, and to join the DivKid Discord community. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!